Trnona and you. Damien and Dullaghan is Anam Dung, Misha and Laura Kunti. Good evening, everybody. My name is Damien Dullaghan, and I'm the Tipperary County Librarian. And I'd like to welcome you all here this evening to our event, our first ever online event in Tipperary Library's history, and my first online event ever in the 25 years that I've been working in library service. These are very different times, but what I would say is, although the pandemic changes the way we do things, it won't change what we do. And with that in mind, I would just like to introduce the topic, which is that Nenagh Library is an EU Direct Information Centre for counties Tipperary, Limerick, Cork and Kerry. And as part of our programme of events for 2020, we are delighted to host this talk entitled A New Push for European Democracy. Before handing over to our moderator, Iva Pocock, who will introduce them momentarily, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome and sincerely thank both of our keynote speakers tonight, Dr. Mary Murphy, lecturer in politics in UCC, and Andy Klom, Deputy Head of the EU Representation in Ireland. We are very, very lucky to have these experts joining us to discuss this very topical issue of democracy in Europe and the threats and the challenges it faces both from within the EU and also from beyond its borders. And of course, we want to hear from you as well. After all, the crux of this topic is democracy. So please feel free to email or send in your questionnaires through the form we've provided tonight, and we'll forward them to our speakers. I'd like to now hand you over to our moderator, Iva Pocock. Iva is a journalist, a communications consultant specialising in environmental, local community and justice issues. She currently works for Ecolis, the European Network for Community-Led Initiatives on Climate Change and Sustainability, and we're delighted that she's here to help us tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Iva Pocock. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Damien. Good evening, everybody, from Nenagh Library. It is indeed an unusual time. So I'd like to welcome you all to the talk this evening. It's entitled A New Push for European Democracy. Is Europe really doing enough to protect its democracy? And I'm delighted to welcome our two keynote speakers, Dr. Mary Murphy, who is a senior lecturer in politics in University College Cork. She's the president of the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies and a fellow of the Centre on Constitutional Change at the University of Edinburgh. She specialises in the study of the European Union relationship with Ireland, both north and south. She has published extensively and most recently is the author of the book Europe and Northern Ireland's Future, Negotiating Brexit's Unique Case. We're also joined by Andy Klom from Dublin, or he's joining us from Dublin. And Andy is the Deputy Head of the European Commission representation in Ireland. He's a long-time official with the European Commission, having been based for many years in Brussels, focused on European foreign policy, and also working in European Commission representation in Marseille in France, in the Netherlands and in Wales. And this last year and this year, he had the, unique role of overseeing the closure of the European Commission's offices in London, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. And he's also involved in the academic area as a visiting professor in Texas, in Austin, and also in Cardiff. So the idea for tonight's talk came from the growing sense amongst academics and commentators that Europe is not doing enough to promote and protect its democracies. And of course, when the idea was initially conceived, we weren't facing a situation where we have a presidential race in the United States, which is unprecedented, with one candidate refusing to commit to upholding the result of the election. So here, and this is one of Europe's oldest allies since the very foundation of the European Union at the end of the Second World War. So what is the librarian here in Nenagh shared with me an article which quoted an academic, Rosa Balfour, who was posing the idea that surveillance policies, anti-terrorism and repressive migration policies are curbing civil society in Europe. Corruption and bad governance are eroding trust in institutions. We need to address citizens' distrust towards political elites. Create new and innovative ways of engaging with voters are necessary. The goal, to make democracy meaningful and fit for the 21st century. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Mary in Cork, who is going to share with us some of her ideas about the European Union and democracy. Mary, can you hear me? Sorry to interrupt you. Mary, I think we have a bit of an issue with, probably with the internet connection, the Wi-Fi at your end. So we're not hearing that clearly here. So I think maybe it just in the hope that the connection will pick up, we'll just go over to Andy, and I'll come back to you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, if that's okay. Andy, can I turn to you?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sorry to take over in this point because I was listening.
Well, I hope we can come back to, but I hope we can come back to Mary.
Well, I hope things pick up for Mary in the meantime then when I'm talking. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with you. It's my first time I'm doing a debate like this in front of my computer, and I have to say I would prefer to actually be there with you and really be able to engage in person in the library. But, you know, we're all living in these very strange times nowadays. So I guess this is quite a miracle that we can engage as it is through these technical means. I want to raise a number of speaking points, around about 5, that I think will be useful for our discussion. And I'm very much looking forward to our discussion afterwards because I want to hear more about the thoughts and ideas that are out there rather than the things I'm going to say. The first issue I want to raise is about the nature of European democracy itself, because, you know, we have 27 different democracies, different types of democracy in the EU, and maybe you could say we have 28 because the EU itself is also a separate level of democracy, and none of them is the same. I know from experience a number of the national democratic models, and you know they vary in great ways. But tonight I'm sort of focusing on the EU institutional level of democracy. And then, you know, when I say EU, I always ask as a first question, what do you mean with EU? Because, you know, there are the EU institutions that Mary was talking about with their particular mix of competences and responsibilities. Sometimes they're strong in certain areas, sometimes they're very weak in other areas. Or are we, if we say the EU, talking about the 27 member states, including Ireland? Or if we say the EU, are we talking about a mix of both the members and the institutions? Now, it's quite difficult to pin down what people mean when they say the EU, because there is no, you know, big central organization that is called the EU. But I guess often when people say the EU, they might mean my employer, the European Commission, which is sort of the executive body in that EU setup. But, you know, that often overlooks the fact that the 27 members themselves, like Ireland, are major players and are sovereign states have a great stake in what happens. Now, that sort of channels my discussion in terms of when I'm talking about the EU, because the second point I would like to raise is populism and what we've seen over the past decade or maybe decades, the rise of populism. Some people say it's linked to globalization. We've been going through this process of globalization over the past 20, maybe 30 years. and populism is a backlash to that. Others say it's linked to the economic crisis of 2008, 2010, and people still being angry about what happened then. Some link it to, let's say, I'm saying it politely, the change in behavior of Russia from around about 2014 onwards, when it invaded Crimea and the eastern Ukraine, and the simmering conflict that is still ongoing there, and the whole attitude of Russia towards the rest of the world, to us, since then. Some people say, and I'm sort of summarizing, what could be possibly the origins of what we're talking about in terms of populism. It goes back to the 2015 refugee crisis, when so many people came into Europe, into our European countries, from the Middle East and from beyond. There's also the rise of national populist parties all over Europe. And we often only look at the past 5 years, but many of them have been around for much longer than that, going back to the 2000s or even before that. So to conclude, there are now identifiable a number of what you could say populist regimes, populist governments throughout the world, like Brazil and Turkey and Russia, but maybe also within the borders of the European Union. And although these developments might seem unrelated to the EU itself, some people say that it's the EU process itself that is a form of globalization, the opening up of borders, the integration of markets, the movement of people to work and live in other countries, that is a cause of that populism. And that's particular maybe to Ireland, some might say the EU response to the 2010 economic crisis is one of the reasons why we see populism in different countries today. I guess, without being able to identify what exactly is the origin, I guess a lot of what you think about populism might depend on the perspective you have, both politically and maybe also the country you're in. Things seen from Ireland might not be the same as things seen from Germany or Poland or some other EU member state. So in terms of the response to populism, there are many things, many elements to distinguish. In the national context, it's primarily the member states, the member state government, that is responsible to deal with the issue. And in that respect, information is a key, very important element in that response. The EU institutions' involvement starts when populism starts to affect EU policies, EU programs, or even more important, EU values. But it's not an automatic given that the EU would step in within a national context to counter populism. But because of the special nature of what the EU is, as I tried to describe, I think it's a process where both institutions and member states work together, and with an emphasis on the member states in terms of what's happening in the national context. So this brings me to my third speaking point, which is about democratic values, about good governance, about the rule of law as basic values of the European Union and as criteria you have to meet in order to be able to join as a new member. This developed over time when initially, all the way back 50, 60 years ago, the first 6 countries came together at that time as the European Economic Community. These values were taken for granted, they were given. And it's only over time when enlargement started to take place with countries that had previously not been democratic, like Greece or Spain or Portugal, that there was more emphasis on these criteria. And then if we get to the 1990s, the end of communism, when so many Central and Eastern European countries re-established democracy and wanted to join the EU, these values became real tests, criteria against which the countries would be judged in terms of qualifying for EU membership. Now, the current developments, 2020, the time we live in, show that we're in a new phase, because we're now looking at these values, part of the EU, and how they relate not to newcomers, but to established member states of the EU, and what to do when members start to diverge from the path of democracy, good governance, and rule of law. And we've had this problem since a few years in Poland and Hungary with the rule of law. And there are only a few elements available, at least to the Commission, to try to act on this. But often as a Commission, when we raise these issues, investigate, question, we encounter barriers in that other EU institution that is called the Council of Ministers. Now the Council, the European Council, the forum where the 27 members, the 27 governments gather, is one of the key decision-making institutions of the EU. And it's there often that members are not fond to criticize other members, and we haven't been able to move forward much in terms of the rule of law issues. However, since the end of 2019, following the European Parliament elections of 2019, there's been a new European Commission led by President Ursula von der Leyen, and she took a new approach. She made rule of law and the situation as one of her priorities, and has tried to set up a new preventive instrument to screen all the member states, not just some where there might be problems, but all 27, including Ireland, and prepare an annual report on the state of rule of law in all 27 countries. And this approach, and we've just had it for the first time this year, the annual report came out 3 weeks ago, focuses on 4 different chapters in every member state. What is the state of affairs in the national justice system? Secondly, what are the anti-corruption frameworks in a member state? Thirdly, what is the state of media pluralism and freedom? And finally, some other issues related to the checks and balances that are necessary to have an effective democratic system. Now, this report has just been published a few weeks ago for all the countries involved. And as you can imagine, some of the countries weren't very happy about what we were saying. But it's the beginning of a new process where we're trying to prevent a change in the status of rule of law democracy rather than following up afterwards. Now, this brings me to the 4th speaking point I wanted to raise, which is the issue of disinformation. It's risen in a big way in the last couple of years. And you might say that the EU and its affairs have suffered for many years under disinformation, not just recently, especially if you look at the situation in the United Kingdom next door, a country where I've worked in the past, in Wales, and worked more recently in the past year, where decades of disinformation or Euromyths put forward by some politicians and some outlets of the media created a situation where by the time we get to 2016, a referendum on Brexit could succeed. And having worked in the UK for many years and recently as well, I can confirm that disinformation still continues to the present day. But disinformation in recent years has had a different nature, and it started spreading to other member states of the Union, and also in other countries. Look at the situation of the United States nowadays. But in every respect, when you have disinformation at a national level, it needs to be met by national authorities. And information is one of the key issues it's all about. Now, the need to encounter it, to face this challenge in the EU and EU member states, for many countries is quite limited, because the press and the media are of high quality, and such high quality that disinformation and alternative facts and truths are marginalized. They don't really have a long shelf life because people will see through them straight away. And I have to say, in that respect, the media in Ireland are at a very high level in terms of fairness and quality, in my view. which makes me, wonder actually what went wrong with the neighbors next door. And, in the run-up to last year's European elections for a new European Parliament, the Commission and the EU member states, and also an EU institution that is called the EEAS, the European External Action Service, that's the diplomatic service of the EU, created a network to identify and counter disinformation attempts to disturb the EU elections and its campaign. And many of those attempts were coming from outside the EU. Now, the European External Action Service had already been doing so for a number of years in terms of foreign policy coverage, in particular facing challenges of Russian disinformation campaigns since the Ukraine invasion. Following that, however, the European Commission itself and its network of European Commission representations in the member states, and also the office I worked for in Dublin covering Ireland, has been doing the same, trying to counter disinformation in member states, identify and then provide arguments against. And this grew out of an experience we had in London over decades, where there was so much disinformation that we put together a special website with all the Euro myths that grew over the years in the British context, and we had to list them in alphabetic order. There were so many of them. But today's populist disinformation doesn't always focus on the EU itself. There are many, many other issues in the national and in the international context, ranging from migration to current times COVID-19, to foreign policy, to national politics. So finally, I'd like to address, as my last speaking point, the issue of more European democracy. And I guess there's much to say there, and we'll be discussing that much more tonight. It's one of the priorities of the current European Commission, led by President von der Leyen, since December last year. And one of her priorities is the new push for European democracy, which should nurture, protect, and strengthen our democracy. Now, the European elections of 2019 had a very high turnout, which showed, the state of health of our democracy. But Europeans need a stronger role in the decision-making process and a more active role in setting priorities. And President von der Leyen thinks in that respect, it would be good if we had what we call a conference on the future of Europe that will allow people to have their say on what's important for and in the EU. Now, needing to protect our democracy against external interference, a joint experience, a joint effort is necessary to counter disinformation. Not just Commission, not just member states, but also a close partnership with the European Parliament, which in the end is next to the Council of Ministers, where the member state governments sit. The European Parliament is where the people's representatives sit, directly elected members of the European Parliament, elected by yourselves. Now, that's a very important element in creating that conference on the future of Europe as, a major pan-European democratic exercise. And we hope the conference will be a public forum for open and inclusive and transparent and structured debate with citizens around priorities and challenges that are on the table for all of us. But, that's the opinion of the Commission. And that's the part of, President von der Leyen's priority to give Europeans a greater say. And also a greater say beyond just, the big cities, Dublin and other capital cities, but really reaching out to Europeans in every corner of every member state. However, it's not up to the Commission to decide it. I mean, the Commission might be the executive, but like also here in Ireland, it's not the government that decides, but it's the Oireachtas that decides on policies and laws. And in the EU context, it's the Council of Ministers, our member state governments, together with the European Parliament, our MEPs, that decide on these things. So the Council and the European Parliament are currently discussing ideas about what they want to do with the Conference on the Future of Europe, what it should be discussing, how it should be organized, what the format should be. And we as Commission are waiting for them to, decide on the final format, because we're actually quite keen to get this discussion going. And to that extent, President von der Leyen has appointed a special vice president, Mrs. Suica, to pursue this issue once the conference is launched. As part of preparations for such a public debate, I'd like to look back a couple of years between 2013 and 2019. Previous European Commissions, led by President Barroso and most recently by President Juncker, they also wanted to engage more closely with citizens in debate through the medium of what we call citizens' dialogues, encounters, engagements like this one tonight. And they did so all around Europe. In the past 5 years, the European Commission organized more than 1,800 citizens' dialogues in all the countries of the European Union, with thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people attending. And in some countries, member state governments also organized such citizen dialogue events. And I know from experience the past couple of years, the Irish government has also been engaged in organizing events about the future of Europe, and they continue to do so. Now, separate from that process of wanting to engage in debate with citizens, President von der Leyen also launched a consultation July this year about a possible European Democracy Action Plan. And the purpose of that action plan is to ensure that citizens are able to participate in the democratic system through informed decision-making that is free from any sort of unlawful interference or manipulation. The plan will also build upon the lessons we've gained from this current period of COVID-19 and also the disinformation that is often linked to that. And we hope it will include measures on electoral integrity, on media freedom, on media pluralism, and on disinformation. But the consultation was closed at the end of September. The Commission is looking at the feedback now, and the intention of the European Commission is to come up with its action plan before the end of this year. Now, these 5 points, the nature of the EU and its democracy, the challenge of populism, the issue of rule of law, the problem of disinformation, and finally, what to do with more European democracy, allow me to draw some very careful, maybe tentative conclusions. Firstly, there is no EU like a superstate, like a federal state, like a federal government that can override members. The EU institutions, Commission, Parliament, Council, and I forgot to mention the Court of Justice, they have specific powers and responsibilities, but they cannot act on their own or act outside of their competence. And the recent COVID-19 pandemic has showed exactly that. Healthcare, all these decades, public health, all this time, have been very much national issues. So when COVID struck us, there was no EU agency with nurses and doctors to help, because that was a national issue. A second conclusion, in many areas, EU members and the EU institutions need to work together to get things done. That's what we're seeing now also with the COVID crisis. We've moved forward. There are many elements of support and recovery ongoing, but we need to work together. And at home in Ireland, that means that the government needs to take the lead, and the Commission and other EU institutions will work together with the government. A third conclusion is that the European Commission wants to bring more dialogue, debate, democracy to citizens, but it can't do so on its own. Here in Ireland, we have a very good cooperation with the Irish government, who are keen on wanting to discuss EU affairs with citizens. but there's also a strong presence of civil society organizations like the European Movement in Ireland, or the Institute of International European Affairs in Dublin, that contribute to a wide discussion on EU affairs. However, we also are very happy and often to work together with the European Parliament that has an office here in Dublin to support their efforts. And finally, as European Commission representation in Ireland, at the office I work for in Dublin, we work together with all these partners, but we also like to make our own contribution, and that's why I'm here tonight, to engage in this debate. So this sums up the issues that I think are important for our discussion tonight, but I very much look forward to hearing more from you to see what your thoughts are about more European democracy.
Thank you, Andy. And that was an excellent overview touching on issues ranging from the EU. What is the EU? What are we talking about when we talk about the EU? Is it the institutions, the national member states, populism, the rule of law, the big thorny issue of disinformation, which is something I think we must definitely discuss after hearing from Mary. Mary, I think you've changed room. So hopefully you've moved. So hopefully you have a stronger connection there. You certainly look clearer and you sound good. So I'm not sure whether you need to go right back to the very beginning of what you were saying, but to pick up where you left off.
Sure.
Thank
I'll
you.
do a slightly abridged version maybe of the presentation. But you can hear me okay, can you?
We can hear you very well, and you're much clearer now than visually. Right. The image is much clearer. Thanks.
Sorry, I didn't realise the Wi-Fi must be weaker upstairs, so I've moved downstairs, and hopefully that solves the problem. But thanks very much, and thanks for bearing with me as well. And I very much enjoyed Andy's contribution, and hopefully I can add to that with my comments. Before my Wi-Fi collapsed on me, I was making reference to the fact that some of the forces which are really coming into play across Europe right now can probably be dated back to the 1990s, when the process of EU integration began to deepen in substantial ways as the EU considered plans for a single currency, and as it also began to think about cooperation in the fields of security policy, and also in the area of judicial and police cooperation, immigration, etc., etc. And in many ways, that period and those developments laid the seeds for a degree of dissent among sections of the European population, probably most pronounced in the UK in the 1990s. But beyond that, spreading to other EU member states from the 2000s onwards. And it's from that period, really, that we begin to see the slow growth of populist and Eurosceptic movements in different EU countries. And that has since become synonymous, really, with a period of quite substantial transformation in terms of European politics. And that transformation has manifested itself in a number of ways, in terms of traditional political parties losing support on the one hand, and being replaced by newer parties, newer emerging parties, which have views and positions and ideologies which are increasingly new, and some of them are built around identity politics. So all of that has sort of become enmeshed to produce the scenario whereby we're seeing an increase in polarization in certain member states, and that is replacing consensus as the norm in European politics, broadly speaking. And I suppose in its worst manifestation, we see it in terms of a turn away from democratic institutions, or what we might term democratic backsliding in some European member states. So then Andy has in many ways already alluded to the growth of populist and Eurosceptic forces across Europe. It's quite interesting, though, because popular support for the EU remains quite strong. And Ireland is perhaps the exemplar of that, because support for the EU in Ireland is usually top of the table, with very high levels of support for the European Union and for the EU integration process. But that actually coexists alongside a growth in the size and the veracity of political forces across Europe in a majority of EU member states, it has to be said. So on the one hand, you have strong popular support, which appears to be resilient, but at the same time, we're seeing a growth in power and the strength and the electoral appeal of populist and Eurosceptic forces. And it is producing a degree of polarization in EU member states and across the EU, broadly speaking. I mean, we have seen support for Eurosceptic parties double in the last 2 decades, since the beginning of this century. And when we try and think about what precisely that encompasses, what populism and Euroscepticism encompasses, in many ways, the sort of classical definition of it is that it's pitting the people against the elite. And in many ways, it's been fueled by developments in European politics, many of them focused around the global financial crisis in the 2007-2008 period, but also linked to the migration crisis as well. And we've seen this, as I've said, we've seen it in a majority of EU member states. So let me just give you some examples of the type of electoral growth we've seen. The National Rally in France won 13% of the vote in 2017. In Germany, Alternative für Deutschland won 13% of the vote in 2017. In Italy, we've seen the Five Star Movement, which is perhaps becoming somewhat more mainstream, it has to be said, winning 33% of the popular vote. But the more far-right inclined Liga movement winning 17% of the vote. We've seen it in Spain with the Vox party winning 15%, but we've perhaps seen it most substantially in countries like Hungary and Poland. In 2018, the Fidesz party, led by Viktor Orban, won 49% of the popular vote. And in Poland in 2019, we saw the Law and Justice Party win 43% of the vote. But on average, across the majority of EU member states, we are seeing a growth in the electoral appeal of these particular parties. It is beginning to tame a little bit in some states, but at the same time, it's becoming energized in other states. And so if you think of, for example, somebody like Matteo Salvini, the leader of the League Party, the Lega Party in Italy, pledging a return to government as Prime Minister and talking about forging alliances with other leaders who share his perspective. And in France as well, we're seeing the National Rally being somewhat buoyed by its European Parliament election results last year and trying to consolidate that support in France more broadly. Now, those sorts of populist movements tend to coexist with Eurosceptic sentiment. And there are different types of Euroscepticism, it has to be said. There's this sort of hard form of Euroscepticism, which is really outright opposition to the European Union. And in many ways, we would associate it with movements for a member state to exit the European Union. But on the other hand, there are softer forms of Euroscepticism, and they are based on objections to particular aspects of the European Union project. Say, for example, a rejection of the single currency project. Now, in the UK, the strength of that anti-EU sentiment, of course, produced the Brexit vote in 2016. And what's interesting about the Brexit vote, and Andy touched on some important points about it, disinformation being one of those points, but the actual impact of the Brexit vote on the European Union, broadly speaking, has been sort of less catastrophic than was initially predicted. There was a commentary at the time which feared what we called Brexit contagion, that other EU member states would follow a similar route. But that simply hasn't materialized. And in fact, what we've seen is some galvanizing of the remaining 27 member states. And Ireland has very much, I suppose, welcomed that because of the way in which it has propped up the Irish position in relation to the Brexit negotiations. However, in some other member states, we are seeing some, I suppose, more concerning developments, particularly in Hungary and Poland. These are two countries where populist leaders have displayed a willingness to tread over democratic institutions in ways which are troubling, and in order to see their own political agendas realized. And I've mentioned the term already. It is equivalent to what we would call democratic backsliding. In Hungary, we see Viktor Orban, leader of the Fidesz party, using authoritarian tactics to entrench his rule. And he talks about building a different kind of democracy, what he labels an illiberal democracy, as opposed to liberal democracy. But the result of that has seen the think tank Freedom House, a respected think tank, global think tank, in 2019, downgrading its assessment of Hungary to being partly free due to what they called sustained attacks on the country's democratic institutions. And we've seen Orban impose all sorts of restrictions across various facets of the political system and society there, in terms of, I suppose, trying to assert some control over the opposition and the media, religious groups, academia, it must be said as well, certain NGOs, asylum seekers, and also the private sector as well. He is, of course, opposed to migration as well, and has built fences and walls around the Hungarian border, seeking to keep out refugees in the context of the refugee crisis. Orban's Fidesz party is a member of the European People's Party in the European Parliament. They have, I think, 13 seats in the European People's Party. And that's an important dimension as well, I think, in terms of understanding some of the difficulties with confronting Hungarian what's happening in Hungary, I suppose. And it sort of, I think, gives us a sense of the deeper challenges that are there in terms of actually dealing with the issue of democratic backsliding in Hungary. Now, Poland is another case in point. The hard-right Law and Justice Party is in power there, and they are seeking to restructure Poland's judicial branch in ways which are concerning. And they have also had an impact on public television as well, in terms of trying to control that and perhaps use it as a form of state propaganda. And they've also cracked down on LGBT activism as well. So these are developments of recent years. They are concerning, but the EU faces enormous difficulties in trying to confront them, and Andy has alluded to some of that. And for Hungary and Poland so far, there have not been sanctions as such, or severe consequences in terms of challenging both of those countries on these issues. Some of the mechanisms that are available in terms of what we call Article 7 of the Treaty of the EU, they have been triggered. They're about suspending a country's voting rights. Their impact has not been substantial. And the European Union Commission's recent rule of law report and early warning system, I guess it remains to be seen how effective a tool that can be in terms of challenging both of these states as well. But as Andy rightly pointed out, it is for the institutions of the European Union, and in particular the European Council and Council of Ministers, to I guess, really confront what's happening there. And it's difficult for them to do that when unanimity remains the norm for dealing with these situations, because Poland and Hungary will invariably side with each other and prevent the emergence of a unanimous response or any sort of unanimous agreement on sanction. Let me just say one word about Ireland, which has been really largely detached from this populist Eurosceptic trend, to the extent at least that we do not see populist, we do not see a strong representation of populism within the Irish Parliament. And those movements, those far-right movements that do exist in Ireland have not managed to penetrate the political system, at least in terms of representation. But that's not to say that there isn't, in some ways, a capacity and a possibility that might emerge in time. So complacency in relation to Ireland being entirely detached or detached long-term from these trends is something that I would caution against. Populism and Eurosceptic forces, they do pose a threat to the European Union, because they're linked to reservations about the EU as a political system, as a legitimate political system. They're also linked to a rejection of certain groups and ethnic minorities and immigrants and difference and others. So in those ways, these forces are potentially significant for the European Union in terms of undermining its roots and undermining its principles and its values as well. Some suggestion as well that in terms of the European Union's future plans, particularly in relation to the Green Deal, I would suggest that that might be the focus of populists' sort of next advance, challenging the green agenda, and again suggesting that the green agenda is a way in which the people can be pitted against the elite. So there's potentially destabilizing forces at play here when we think about some of these trends that we've seen in European politics over recent years. At worst, some might suggest it's an existential threat to the European Union. Now, I don't think we necessarily see hard and fast evidence of that at this point, but nevertheless, the incremental and gradual growth of support and an increase in the electoral appeal of these forces is something which suggests that there must be a cautious eye cast on them. Just briefly, let me finish by mentioning some of the external threats. And again, I think Andy has alluded to some of this. Relations with Russia have been very strained for the European Union over recent years since the annexation of Crimea. And just recently, we've seen the attempted assassination attempt on opposition leader Alexei Navalny. And concerns as well. Concerns about disinformation campaigns that Russia has been involved in. Turkey on Europe's borders is another country which the EU is currently experiencing tensions with. Turkey has its own geopolitical and geostrategic ambitions, and Erdogan, its leader, does have authoritarian tendencies as well. So there is the potential for destabilization there as well. And I would mention the US presidential election as well, which is nearly upon us. That is also important for the European Union. The current president, Donald Trump, is no fan of the European Union. So what happens in the next 2 weeks will be important in terms of future US-EU relations, and also important in terms of Brexit as well, it has to be said. So let me conclude by just saying that all of the above, it paints a very complex picture. And it points to some problematic developments, which the European Union in many ways has been resilient in the face of up to this point. But it does demand a response, and trying to frame a response to what's happening is a very substantial challenge. And I know Andy talked about the future of Europe, the conference on the future of Europe, which many of us are interested to see. That is an exercise, and there have been similar exercises in the past. This one may be distinct in its own right, but it is an attempt, I suppose, to underline the legitimacy of the European Union and to give voice to European citizens in ways that may help to placate some of the tensions and some of the problems that citizens are encountering in terms of their understanding of the EU and in terms of their interactions with the EU. But I don't think we should underestimate the magnitude and the complexity of the challenge that we're facing in terms of confronting all of these issues. A 27 member state European Union is a large European Union, and it's a diverse European Union, and it's a complex European Union. And it can make for a difficult decision-making environment. So even the fact that the Future of Europe conference has not yet kicked off, I think maybe even speaks to some of the challenges that there are in trying to cement and embed all of the different features of what that experiment will be. So there are attempts to address these problems, these very complex problems. And I suppose I would finish by saying I think it's in all our interests that we can meet those challenges.
Mary, that was great. Great that the line held excellently there. So I'd like to, I suppose, go back a little bit just to pick up on the point that Andy was making in relation to, you know, the EU institutions. What do we mean by the EU? And this commitment to trying to reach out to citizens, so that citizens feel, you know, have a much better understanding of the European Union institutions and are more engaged with the European Union. And I'm just wondering, to what extent do you think that what happened, like in 2005, when we had a referendum in France and in the Netherlands on the European Constitution, which was rejected, and then we had in Ireland a number of years later, we had a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, which was rejected, and then we had another referendum. I'm just wondering to what extent this kind of laid the foundations for what has happened with the departure of the UK from the European Union, and to what extent it is the actual workings of the European Union and the way that it is set up, the architecture that needs to respond, rather than just focusing on discussions about the European Union. Andy, maybe you could speak to that.
You know, you see in the timeline you just described a wish, a will to want to involve people, citizens, in the decision making, although, you know, just at key moments on very big issues. And, you know, through the use of referenda, you get quite unpredictable, unexpected outcomes. Speaking about democracy in all our 27 countries, there are certain member states of the EU that don't use referenda, that think referenda could provide a perverse outcome. And one of those countries, for instance, is Germany, which used to have referenda in the 1930s, which led to unexpected consequences. Now, of course, we also have the example of referenda as a way for much more direct democracy. If we're discussing, for instance, the Swiss model, where you put a referendum to the people on smaller issues, but not so much the big changes of life. So I guess there's this paradox of wanting to engage much more the people, the citizens, in the decision making, and that's also, you know, a long-standing complaints about the EU process. A lack of democracy, the so-called democratic deficit. But then the referendum instrument itself is quite blunt and can be, well, maybe easily manipulated, as 2016 with the Brexit referendum shows us. And of course, we still don't know what, you know, the real background was to that, all the motives for people to vote the way they voted, but also all the players, actors, instruments, information and disinformation applied to get that referendum result. So in that respect, I don't think that with the current discussion about this conference on the future of Europe, that at least EU governments are looking back to what they did in the early 2000s and wanting to, you know, seek a repeat of that. I think they're much more looking at what we've been doing in the past couple of years as Commission, setting up all these citizens' dialogues, really going out into countries beyond the big cities, wanting to engage in small discussions with citizens and gleaning information, gleaning ideas about what people are concerned about and what they see as where they want to head for the future. And if there is going to be such a conference on the future of Europe process, the Commission, at least for its part, but there'll be also other partners, will try to re-engage again in a whole series of citizens' dialogues, also hopefully here in Ireland. But that won't be the only element, because that's, you know, one of the discussion points still ongoing between the Council of Ministers and the Parliament and the Commission in between. But there should also be something at the central level that engages citizens. And, you know, people in Brussels have been looking at the example here in Ireland of citizens' assemblies and how that's set up and how that functions on important issues of national and societal significance, and how, that type of model could be used to involve citizens beyond, all the dialogues and debates that we might be doing in individual countries. But going back to that, idea of a single one-off referendum, here's the big text, and, you say yes or no. That's, to my knowledge, not really part of what, all those institutions and countries are currently discussing.
Okay. Mary, thank you, Andy. Mary, you mentioned about threats, external threats, and looking to Turkey and the US. I mean, and the poisoning of the Russian Alexei Navalny. I mean, do you think that in terms of protecting the values of democracy within the European Union, do you think that we are managing to respond effectively enough? I mean, what are the signals that are going out in response to this man ending up in Berlin? And I understand, I mean, it's absolutely accepted that he was indeed poisoned by an illegal nerve agent.
Yeah, I suppose this is another challenge for the European Union in many ways. Its capacity to respond as a collective and as a single unit to external developments is somewhat constrained by the nature of the EU's capacity when it comes to foreign policy or security issues. These tend to be contested depending on what member states' positions, individual member states' bilateral relationships might be with, for example, Russia or Turkey, or even the United States. And the capacity for the European Union to speak with a single voice is often challenged by just the nature of the situation, and by the fact that common and foreign and security policy and issuing statements and putting in place responses requires, for the most part, unanimity. So it requires agreement of 27 member states around the table. And that can make the process of responding to developments like this all the more challenging. Now, having said that, the response to the Russian situation and the poisoning of Navalny, I keep getting his name wrong, has been pretty robust, I think. And Russia-EU relations, they have been tense since the annexation of Crimea. And that tension has been as a consequence of the EU being, I suppose, reasonably comprehensive in its response. Now, in terms of the sanctions which it's been placing on Russia, again, we could query the extent to which they are substantial and proportionate to what's happening. But there's difficulties here as well, sort of geostrategic difficulties in terms of the relationship with Russia and the supply of energy to EU member states as well. So there's a whole range of very complex issues tied up in this that relate to the structure of the European Union and its capacity to speak with a single voice, the variety of different bilateral relationships that exist, and some of the sort of core needs that member states have in terms of access to energy. So there's lots at play here, which makes the situation challenging. And I suppose the European Union can only go to a certain point in terms of responding. And I think to this point, in terms of the Russian situation and actually the Turkish situation as well, the response has been reasonably robust.
In relation to disinformation, I mean, we live in an age where the feed that you're getting on your social media, Kathy, well, it might actually be very similar to what Andy is getting, but, people are getting personalized information. We've seen this in relation to Brexit. We're seeing it in the United States. At the moment, documentaries about Cambridge Analytica, the kind of level of manipulation and the specificity with which people's individual media feeds, social media feeds, are honed to hook in on them. Like, what is the European Union doing about this? I mean, are the institutions in any way equipped or robust to be able to deal with this technological reality? Andy, is that something that you'd like to, or Kathy, would you like to?
Well, you know, yes, please go ahead.
Kathy, you go ahead. Kathy, you go ahead, because we didn't hear from you so much. So you go ahead and I'll come back to Andy then. Kathy.
So it's me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
I can, yeah. No, I just wanted to make a very preliminary point, because I think Andy is better placed to talk about the detail of this. But I mean, I would just underline the fact that the European Union is absolutely 100% aware of the extent to which disinformation is problematic, and has been making very substantial efforts to deal with that particular challenge. So I wouldn't for a moment, like viewers to think that this isn't on the radar, because it absolutely is on the radar. And Andy, you can probably speak in more detail to what's happening.
Well, I was going to mention two particular examples. Last year's European Parliament elections, where because of so much disinformation in previous years during national election campaigns, like in France and the Netherlands and other countries, there was a great fear that European elections would be disturbed and manipulated by outside forces wanting to steer forwards the sort of populist wave. And at that time, the member state governments and the European Commission and the European Diplomatic Service, the European External Action Service, came together to set up a network where we could alert each other to stories breaking out that were plainly wrong or plainly false. And we could, provide an immediate feedback to correct that. And that system continues to today, at least in terms of the external attempt to disinform the European public. But as a second example, we see what happened or is happening still this year with the COVID pandemic. Again, there is, much disinformation going around. And there the Commission, as sort of, the executive body of the EU, has engaged in close contact with all the different social media platforms to, promote measures that we have authentic content on those platforms, and that they should remove misleading or illegal or harmful content. And you see that more and more happening. Of course, you can always argue, is it enough? Is it complete enough? That the future will have to show. But those are, examples of how we are engaging with that, challenge of disinformation that distorts, in many respects, the, perspective of many citizens. And, one of the things that we, have to recognize as being something different compared to maybe, 25 years ago, is that we have, a whole new digital field out there through which we engage with news and reality. But that has also channeled and funneled us into certain perspectives, shutting out all other voices. And that makes, the issue of media, press pluralism and press freedom so important. And I guess, Ireland is a good example of how, having such a balanced and fair and unbiased media landscape makes such a difference in, informing citizens compared to, what I've seen and what we all know about the British press, and in particular the English press, and how that ends up funneling people into a particular perspective and, no longer able to see beyond that.
Can you hear me, Andy?
Yes, now I can.
Yeah?
Thank you.
So we have a question here. Thank you, Andy, for your response there. We have a question here. How far do you think the spread of populism is in at least part furnished by the growth in economic inequality, particularly in countries such as the UK and Hungary. Mary.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the important part of that question is at least part furnished. So I do think that economic inequality, and in particular the global financial crisis being the trigger for sort of revealing the extent of inequality, has been a factor in furnishing populism. But populism is more than that as well. It is built around this grievance whereby there is a distinction to be made between sort of the pure people, so to speak, and the elite. And there is an element of identity politics as well, which is woven into the populist sentiment, which to some extent is about fear of the other. You know, this notion, this sort of I suppose it's epitomized really by an anti-immigrant sentiment as well. So populism in and of itself is really quite complex. It's been fueled in part by the global financial crisis and a growing sense of inequality, and also, I guess, a rejection of how the European Union in particular dealt with the global economic crisis. But it is more than that as well. It is born out of sort of this difference and distinction between peoples, and the fear that can potentially be harnessed around that. So it's a complex theme, and it has many dimensions and facets, and inequality is just one of them, I would suggest.
Thanks, Mary.
Maybe I could just add
Andy,
a comment
yes.
to that.
Absolutely,
because Mary raised an important issue. You know, the inequalities given, you know, from the economic crisis 10 years ago, or sometimes people say given even longer ago because of the globalization process, where, you know, certain people, certain groups of people are losing out because they have the wrong skills and are in the old-fashioned sectors of the economy and are losing jobs, and where others are, you know, gaining the right skills and the new economy and the digital economy. All of that, you know, is quite a complex mix and could be true. But what I've seen from the experience of that explosion of populism in 2016, the Brexit referendum in the UK, is that has had a reverse impact on the populism in some other European member states, where until that time, many were listening to the song of skeptics coming from the UK and thinking we have to go into the same direction of less Europe, or, you know, leaving the European Union, and, you know, all that package. The referendum really gave a lot of people in other countries a fright and a shock, and made them realize that, you know, with all its imperfections and all its problems, the EU is not as bad as the alternative. And for that reason, the populist tendencies in other member states, at least regarding European skepticism and criticism, declined and was reduced. And you see the populism then, as Mary described, shifting towards nationalism, identity politics, racial politics, etc., rather than the opposition to the EU or anything related to it.
Thanks, Andy. I mean, I suppose that is relevant for the question that I have here coming in from an E. Burke. The UK has always had one foot out the door, so they are not typical of other countries in the EU. So do the panel think that no other country really wants to leave the EU?
Yes, the UK is distinct relative to other EU member states, I would suggest. It's you know, it didn't just suddenly decide in 2016 that it didn't like the European Union. It's long had a troubled relationship with the European Union. It's even having been invited to join the original 6 member states, the founding 6 member states in 1957, the UK chose not to, but then of course did join in 1973. And even it was in many ways a reluctant decision in 1973. It wasn't a wholehearted reinforcement of the European ideal, the British decision to join. And the relationship has been troubled since then. The UK has always, I suppose, felt a degree of exceptionalism in terms of its own position within the European Union. Its history is distinct and its politics is distinct from that which we see in other EU member states as well. And in many ways, that troubled relationship with the EU persisted over time. It wasn't as evident until the 1990s. And during the 1990s, we saw the emergence of the UK Referendum Party, which was agitating for a referendum. And from that, we see the development of UKIP in the 2000s. But all along, I suppose, that reservations about the EU existed within the United Kingdom. And those reservations were built around concerns about the impact of the EU on national sovereignty and on British identity as well. And they were never wholly tackled by the British political establishment. And that was because even the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, to a lesser degree, have similarly had troubled relationships with the European Union and haven't really ever sort of galvanized their position on one side or the other. Those parties have been split and divided on the issue for many years. And they've also had a media, the British media, perhaps the tabloid media in particular, but not solely the tabloid media, has, as Andy alluded to, been a thorn in the side of the European Union. And the British public, I suppose, has been fed that diet of misinformation for many, many years. And it culminated in 2016 in all of these forces coalescing and being manipulated as well by the level of disinformation. So the EU, or the UK at least, is somewhat exceptional. And I don't think any other EU member state is comparable in that sense. But at the same time, I don't think we can be complacent about the ability of these forces to emerge and in some ways to be manipulated and exploited in other EU member states as well. But for now, there's no one knocking at the exit door right now. And in fact, the British route and departure process out of the EU has been so troubled and so challenging and so difficult that no other member state is looking on thinking, I fancy a bit of that. So the UK is a unique case in point, I think. But I wouldn't allow that to let us be overly complacent about the possibility of it not spreading to other EU member states.
Thank you, Mary. One question that I would like to ask, just in relation to climate change. Undoubtedly, the biggest threat that not just Europe, but one of the biggest threats that we're facing globally is the climate emergency. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that the strength of European democracies will be a factor in our ability to stem the emission of climate-changing gases and to completely decarbonize our lives? Andy?
The European Commission runs this regular opinion poll for many decades now called Eurobarometer, where we're trying to check on a regular basis a whole range of questions with citizens in all the member states, and sometimes also particular polls on specific topics. And for years now, climate change has been trending as a major issue for citizens in all the member states. Now, that doesn't say, of course, that all the member state governments are equal in their opinion about its priority or not. But you do see more and more in most of the member states that governments are pursuing this within the framework of their national democracies. Some countries, for instance, like Poland, have greater problems with change, the switchover, because they are so embedded in some of the older industries like the coal industry. But that is, of course, a challenge to be solved, but not a challenge to be avoided. At the European level, it's clear, in all the institutions, the Parliament, the Commission, that climate change is seen as the main issue we were hoping to face at the beginning of this year before the COVID pandemic struck us. And Mrs. von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, has made it her number one priority to be dealt with during her mandate. And also to that extent, that when, on the proposal of the Commission, the members decided in the summer on this huge recovery package of funding to get out of this crisis and to move forward to economic recovery beyond this crisis. Climate change as being made as the number one priority and the digital transformation as the number two priority. So at least in the European context, but also in many of the member states, it is clearly there on the table. And it was on the table until we got stuck in this COVID pandemic, which of course none of us could have foreseen. But at least from as far as the Commissioners is concerned, we're trying to make the Green Deal, the Green Revolution, as part of the solution of the recovery of the COVID pandemic, which we hope to lead soon.
Thank you, Andy. We're nearly coming to the end of our evening. So there's one question that has come in here, which is, I'll just get it up here. And it's quite it's quite a profound question. And it reminds me, I guess, of, the reality of, I spent a short amount of time in some of the Baltic states. And when you talk to people there, you realize that they have no illusions that enormous, complex institutions will survive ad infinitum like the USSR. So I wonder, this is a question that's come in. Do the panel feel that the EU will survive as such a large entity? I mean, given what we're facing a pandemic, an unprecedented pandemic. We're facing climate change. We're facing Brexit. We're facing, a US election across the Atlantic. Do you think the EU will survive? Mary.
Well, I have a start at this first. I mean, that's a huge question, obviously, and as somebody who teaches European Union politics, one of the things we teach students is theories of EU integration. So we look at theories which account for the way in which the European Union has developed since the 1950s, and we look at theories like intergovernmentalism and theories like neo-functionalism. And the reason I say that is because in recent years, in addition to talking about theories of EU integration, we are now seeing in the scholarship the emergence of theories around EU disintegration. Now, this is a very small field and a very young field of study. And what it's telling us is that there is certainly the possibility of EU disintegration. But at the same time, it's pointing to the fact that what needs to happen for the EU to disintegrate is not currently in place. So I don't think that I suppose as social scientists and as a political scientist, we're not closed off to the possibility of the EU disintegrating and collapsing in some way, shape, or form. But at the same time, the signs of that happening are not especially evident at this moment in time. Brexit was a moment where we did see some potential for contagion, but that did not materialize. In fact, the opposite probably materialized. The EU galvanized in ways that were even unexpected. So I suppose in answering this question, I would say that for now, the EU looks like it can and will survive. And I say that against the backdrop of, the unprecedented challenge that is the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you.
And it has survived many crises and many challenges down through the years. Going back to the 1960s, what was called the empty chair crisis, going back to recessions, oil crises, the global financial crisis in 2008, the Brexit crisis, etc., etc. So the EU has displayed a degree of resilience over many years. And I suppose if I was a betting woman, I would put money on that resilience remaining the name of the game for the years to come.
Thank you, Mary. And Andy, maybe one quick last word. Do you think the European Union will survive?
Yes. I'm troubled by, the concept of the EU as a large entity. And, it brings me back to my very first comments, my first speaking point. What is the EU? Is there, this big entity that is the EU, like the federal government? And the basic idea is the EU is not a federal union. And there is no EU superstate. It's a network of a few institutions and 27 still sovereign member states that are sovereign in many areas of policy making. And even if they have joined hands together to work together on certain areas of sovereignty within the context of the EU, it doesn't mean that they've been replaced or they've disappeared. And that's the big difference between the European Union and what I would call the American Union. The European Union, as a small organization, works through its members. All the laws, all the regulations are not applied or implemented by EU authorities. They are applied by national authorities, Irish authorities, and not by a federal government. And it brings me back to my brief experience of living in the United States. Just after I arrived in the great state of Texas, and had to go to the federal government building to get my social security number. I mean, only in that building in Austin, the state capital, there were 5,000 federal government employees implementing the policies and the competences of the US federal government. The office where I work nowadays in Dublin, where we represent the European Commission, the EU executive, I work there with 18 colleagues covering the whole of Ireland. And I think that shows, in a very simplistic way maybe, the difference in concept, but also in size of what the EU is. The EU is very much Ireland itself, and France, and Portugal, and all those assets that those governments and those countries bring to the table to make sure that what the EU collectively decides is then also done. So for that to survive is, of course, it's necessary that that network and that decision-making process continues. And also, that when challenges arise, that you have to sit down and reassess, should we do this on our own or should we do this collectively? And I think the COVID-19 crisis has showed us yet again another frontier that the EU has met. Healthcare, public health, were national competencies, national sovereignty. And the EU at best, helped with benchmarking and exchanges and collaboration, but didn't have a role in that respect. And the past 6 months have been a little bit of a revolution for the EU in trying to find a role in helping the 27 members to meet the challenge. And also maybe sometimes stretching our competences in new areas where we've never been before. Like, for instance, the centralized procurement of PPE, of medication, of ventilators, and currently ongoing procuring for all European member states vaccines that are under development. And I guess, will we survive? I guess if we can respond to future challenges in the same way that we are responding today to the COVID challenge, my estimation is we'll survive as an EU that is not a federal state or a super state, but an EU that is a union of countries and of peoples.
Thank you, Andy. An optimistic view of the European Union, which is indeed, obviously, with 27 member states now and the many different peoples and languages, it is a remarkable project. And yes, let's hope that we are able to face the democracies that we live in the European Union will allow us to face the great challenges that are before us. So I'd like to thank both of you very much for joining us here in Nenagh from Cork and from Dublin. I'd like to thank the people who sent in questions and comments. And I would like to now hand over to Damien from Nenagh Library and wish you a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Iva. I suppose to sum up and just say tonight's been a very interesting night. It's been the first time we've ever done this. I feel it has gone well, and there's a very good number of reasons as to why it has gone well. A few thank yous, I think, just to finish up. Firstly, I'd like to thank the staff of Nenagh Library and Nenagh Edic. They've put a huge amount of effort into this, and they've really tried their very best to make this a success. And I think it has been, and it has been a very different and learning experience, and it's been well worth it. I'd also like to thank our technical partners, A-Live Systems. They've been absolutely terrific. We've been watching in the back office, and it's been fascinating to see both ends of it, where we could see what you see at home, but also we could see the back end work that was going on here, and they've been here all day, and they've done a terrific job. It's really, really excellent. I'd like to thank our moderator. I'd like to thank Iva Pocock. You know, because this was different and because this was new, we wanted a really high quality moderator. And you know, the old saying goes, experience is a great teacher. And Iva is a very experienced journalist, and we knew she'd do an excellent job, and she has. And we'd just like to thank you very much, Iva, for that. I'd like to thank our speakers tonight, Dr. Mary Murphy and Andy Klom. You know, it was a fascinating subject and a very, very relevant at this moment in time. The world is in a state of flux, so it was really, really interesting to hear from both of you. And, you know, I think it was so fitting that that we had a talk on democracy in the library, because it is a truly democratic space, and it's one thing we're very proud of. You know, I always say, you know, that when we give these talks, or many talks, we say it's not Tipperary County Council's library, it's not the government library, it's your library. And regardless of the format, whether it's tonight it'll be online and hopefully you'll be back inside here soon enough, it is still your library, the citizens' library. And I think tonight was such a fitting topic to talk about democracy, so I think that was really, really relevant. I suppose I'll just finish up and say that normally on these times I would say safe home, but you all are at home, so I suppose it'd be more fitting to say stay safe. Okay, thank you very much.